Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Track 2 of the 2021 Midwest Manure Summit. My name is Lissa Seefeld, and I am the agriculture educator with Extension Eau Claire County, and I will be your host for this track. Right now, I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Joe Harrison. Dr. Harrison is a livestock nutrient management specialist at Washington State University. In addition to his research and extension responsibilities, he teaches the Cooperative University Dairy Students, or CUDS course, an undergraduate student cooperative that manages their own 35-cow dairy herd. Dr. Harrison is classically trained as a dairy nutritionist and has developed expertise in the area of whole farm nutrient management, which involves the integration of animal nutrition, agronomy, crops and soils, engineering, and economics. Areas of research interest include a reduction in nitrogen import to dairy farms in feeds by precision ration balancing, extraction of phosphorus from liquid dairy manure for off-farm use as fertilizer, relationship of manure application to groundwater, nitrate content, fate and transport of bacteria in manure managed in aerobic digester, transformation and utilization of anaerobically digested manure for crop production, and potassium nutrition of the early lactation dairy cow. Dr. Harrison will be presenting Reconnecting the Nutrient Cycle, Capture of Phosphorus from Liquid Dairy Manure as Struvite and Its Use for Alfalfa Production. And we'd like to remind everybody that this session has been generously sponsored by Profit Pro Ag.
Hello, I'm Dr. Jim Ladley with Profit Pro Ag, the home of the Manure Master technology. I'd like to welcome you all here to the Midwest Manure Summit. I know you'll get a lot out of the presentations you'll see here, and I hope to see you in person next year. Our company deals with the tail end of the livestock story. I mean literally what comes out the tail end. We are representing the Manure Master brand of products here today. We have been helping producers solve their manure issues for over 20 years, and in that time we have become known as the manure management experts. Proper manure management is critical for a lot of reasons, but especially as it relates to good environmental stewardship and good neighbor relations. We have products that tackle the toughest issues of odor, crusting, flies, bottom solids, gases, and also agitation foam. At the end of the day, we can show a positive return on your investment in terms of environmental stewardship, manure handling efficiency, nutrient management, and safety. For manure applicators, we liquefy the manure so it requires less agitation, and our manure mechanical defoamer allows you to fill faster and haul full loads. We work with dairy producers throughout the Midwest, including dairies in Wisconsin, on their manure issues. In closing, if you have issues with your manure management program, we can help. Call for a free on-site consultation on how we can help you better manage your dairy manure for any reason. Give us a call at 507-373-2550 or check out our website at manuremaster.com. Again, that is manuremaster.com. You will always get a real person that will help you solve your manure issues. Looking forward to hearing from you soon. Thank you and God bless.
And with that, Dr. Harrison, the floor is yours and you can share your screen.
Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining a virtual conference. So I'm originally from Ohio, moved out here to Washington State in 1984, and this is where I spent my career. So you got to hear about all the different interests I've had. But today we're going to talk about phosphorus, and so let's just get rolling in that. My work in this phosphorus area began about 20 years ago, and we'll develop that a little bit. But this is a picture of the Tulalip Indian tribe, which is just north of Seattle, and they're called the people of the salmon. And working with this tribe with some of our phosphorus and environmental work really influenced me in a great way, because one of the things was that they talked about, particularly the chairman of their tribe said he had a responsibility when making decisions to look out 7 to 10 generations. And that has really stuck with me. That, many people have a 5 to 10 year plan, maybe have a plan to transition their farm to the next generation. But wow, to look out 7 or 10 generations and try to make decisions based on that is pretty challenging, but also can be pretty powerful. So I leave you with that. It's had a big impact on me, and I think, particularly as we think about phosphorus, we do have to take the long look. So start out with this triangle to kind of get us focused about what we'll be visiting a little bit about today. So the three key factors in the triangle are the cow, manure results from the cow, and then homegrown feeds, as well as imported nutrients. So as we look at how we can impact phosphorus management to farm, feed management in terms of precision feeding can certainly be a part of that. We can try to limit the use of high phosphorus byproduct feeds, but I will acknowledge that many times those are quite valuable for their nitrogen or protein sources and energy in some cases, but they tend to carry a lot of phosphorus along with them that may not be needed in the diet. So we try to lower the phosphorus in the diets, and we can do that successfully and still get good performance from the cows. And we can also look at multiple rations as a way of better targeting the nutrient needs of our animals. Then secondly, we can, as it relates to manure and storing of nutrients, we can look at capturing phosphorus in the form of easily exported, in an easily exported form. And we'll talk about that as a primary focus today. Homegrown feeds, they can also have an impact, because selection of forage type and acreage can impact the need for imported nutrients, as well as cover crops, multiple cropping, just better able to use those nutrients from the cow's manure. And then finally, back to feed management again, bringing it full circle. As a result of all these, we can do a better job with precision feeding and decrease the import of nutrients to the farm, both in the term of feeds as well as fertilizer. So points to consider as we look at phosphorus. One is that the world reserves of rock phosphate are finite. In other words, it's not a renewable resource. We got lots of nitrogen in the air that we can capture and pull that in as fertilizer. But with phosphorus, what we're doing is we're mining it from different places in the world. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Secondly, phosphorus losses from agricultural systems do contribute to water pollution in many countries, as well as the U.S. And I'm sure many of you see this in the popular press. Offering low phosphorus diets can make a contribution to reducing excess phosphorus on the farm, but they can only go so far. And so we're going to have to look at additional strategies, and one of those we'll be discussing today. I'm sure many of you have seen pictures like this or similar pictures where we see these blue-green algae productions in freshwater bodies. And typically in freshwater bodies anyhow, this eutrophication, eutrophication means a enrichment of the nutrients in a water body, and the two nutrients that tend to trigger these algal blooms are nitrogen or phosphorus. In freshwater bodies, it tends to be phosphorus that tips the scale and creates these algal blooms. So I know, particularly in the Midwest, we tend to see these algal blooms during the summer, and particularly in the areas where there's quite a bit of lakes. So back to the topic of where in the world is all the phosphorus. This was data that was published about 10 years ago. The same trends exist today. And about 85% of all the easily mineable rock reserves for phosphorus are found in Morocco and Western Sahara. And you can see here where the United States came in at about 3%. China 6%, Brazil 1%, Jordan about 2%. So we've got a little bit of a geopolitical situation here where we have a very important nutrient that is the large reserves are held by one country. And so this could become an issue of sustainability for food production. So we need to keep that in mind as we're making decisions about capturing and recycling phosphorus. As we look at how much phosphorus has actually been produced, all these dots as we go from 1900 up to about, in this case, was about 2010, up towards this projected peak here about 2040, so about 20 years from now. They expect that we'll hit the peak mining, so that'll be certainly within our lifetimes. And so yeah, we're not just making more of this material. It's going to be more. We're going to need to look at ways to recycle the phosphorus. Okay, so several times during my talk, you're going to see a transition slide like this, and it'll say transition. And the reason I've done that is there's multiple aspects to this talk today, and I wanted to give you at least a moment to kind of say, okay, I'm going to see something different at this point. So now we're going to start back at the cow and build our way back up. So with phosphorus, the cow uses about 13% of what she consumes for maintenance of the animal. About 27% of it goes in the milk carton, and about 60% of it remains in the manure. Most of it in the feces, very little of it in the urine. That's just the way the physiology works with a dairy cow. And so less than a third of the phosphorus that the cow eats actually is going to get shipped off farm in the form of milk. So that's going to leave almost 2/3 of it on farm to be used for crop production. And we can do that and use it well if there's enough acreage. But typically, we've got an imbalance between the amount of manure and the nutrients in that manure and what's available for a land base to actually utilize it. So here in Washington State, I developed what I call the Whatcom County view of reality as related to phosphorus. This little red circle is Whatcom County up here near the Canadian border. I'm actually located down here close to Tacoma, is where my office is. And then our main campus is over here on the east side of the state, just south of Spokane. So we have a lot of dairy production here on the west side of the Cascade Mountains. And then here on the east side, particularly in what we call this greater Columbia River Basin, we see a lot of dairies, but we also have a lot of alfalfa production, as well as about 150 other crops that are grown in eastern Washington. So again, we're going to focus on this one county up here because I had good data to make some calculations. So in 2002, when I first really began to focus on this, cows were milking about 23,000 pounds at that point in the county, and we had about 62,000 milk cows. So when you start doing the math, if you take about 0.09% phosphorus in milk, cows eating about 52 pounds of dry matter intake for the lactating herd, about 0.4% phosphorus in the feed, that would have meant that those cows would have eaten about close to 2,400 tons of phosphorus in a given year. 637 tons of that would have been exported in milk, gone off for human consumption. We then take that amount that was eaten, we subtract out the amount that was used there for exported in milk, and the manure from these cows was applied to about 44,000 acres. In our state, back in 1998, all farms were required to have a nutrient management plan, so we had good data in early 2000s with regard to how many acres this manure was being applied to. And for that county, it was about 44,000 acres. So that resulted in about 1,700 tons of positive balance of phosphorus. So what would it have taken to get a positive or a neutral phosphorus balance in that county? Well, we had an excess of about 77 pounds of phosphorus per acre that wasn't needed for crop production. So we do the math, we were going to need another 44,000 acres to utilize all that manure. Well, there wasn't another 44,000 acres available at that time, and there isn't now either. A lot of this acreage in that particular county is very competitive for raspberry production and blueberry production, as well as other vegetable and row crops. And so pretty competitive area for land use. So we got to look at some other solutions. One thing to do some calculations and say, hey guys, you got a problem. And it's another to actually put some time and try to see if we can come up with a way to manage it. So that's what I've spent the last 18 years doing. If we expand this out and look at it at a US level, we got a lot of corn production and other soybeans and so forth here in the central part of the US. You see this little tractor down here, an excavator, that's where we've got a lot of our phosphorus extraction being done in the United States, is actually in Florida. So that gets exported to the Midwest, used as nutrient for fertilizer. Then we export all these feedstuffs out to the rest of the US. So we really have what is called a disconnected nutrient cycle. So at least here regionally, we decided about 10 years ago to put an effort into seeing what we could do to create a bit of a recycling relationship here between the dairy industry and crop industry here in the state. So again, transition, we're going to shift off and talk a little bit about more details of background on why we kind of got in the situation that we're in. So we look at the impact of manure management on the nitrogen and phosphorus ratio. And the last presenter talked on this a bit too, as it related to nitrogen and manure. With raw manure, this ratio between nitrogen and phosphorus approaches about 6. So we got lots of nitrogen in relation to phosphorus. And we know that our crops need a lot of nitrogen for growth. If we look at lagoon stored manure, and at least in our state, nearly 100% of the manure is stored in lagoons. So we're going to see a lot of loss of nitrogen as ammonia. And so we've got a ratio then with lagoon stored manure of about 2.3, only twice as much nitrogen as phosphorus, up to maybe about 4.5. And this range relates to the amount of solids content that might be there in the manure. So with lagoon storage, we're losing the nitrogen to the atmosphere. The phosphorus is not volatile, so it's still staying with the manure. So we have this imbalance. So we take this simple example where we've got raw manure and we've got a bucket of it, and this bucket is going to provide us with 100 pounds of nitrogen that we need for the crop and 17 pounds of phosphorus that we need. Now, if we're subsequently using not just raw manure, but we're using lagoon stored manure and the associated losses with that nitrogen from the lagoon stored manure, we might only have maybe 54 pounds of nitrogen in that same liquid volume of manure, but we'd still have that same amount of phosphorus because the phosphorus is not volatile. So if we needed 100 pounds of nitrogen for crop production, we're going to need another smaller bucket of manure to get that nitrogen. And in this case, we need 46 pounds of nitrogen. Well, that quantity of manure needed is going to carry along with it another 14 pounds of phosphorus. But we don't really need that 14 pounds of phosphorus. So now we're up to 31 pounds of phosphorus. So at least and I realize this is kind of a simplistic cartoon picture, but I think it does a pretty good job of getting the point across that our manure management practices over time have resulted in part in why we have this imbalance between nitrogen and phosphorus. And we begin to see these buildup of phosphorus in our soil. Okay, so once we have land applied that manure and we have phosphorus, traditionally it was thought that the only way that phosphorus left the farm was via this runoff pathway. In other words, if you could get it incorporated, if you could get a cover crop on there, you could limit the amount of phosphorus that was leaving and going to surface waters. And so that was a traditional thing that was taught for decades, let's say from the 70s through maybe even about 2000. And actually, there was even recommendations that you could bank phosphorus in the soil and, put on multiple years worth. And and then as it relates to what might happen with percolation or movement of rainwater and then moving nutrients out into groundwater, you typically see that for nitrate and potassium, mostly nitrate, which becomes the issue. But the studies have been done over the last few decades. What they really found out was phosphorus actually, once it saturates in the soil loses its ability to hang on to that phosphorus. We can actually then begin to see loss of phosphorus out through tile lines and other normal routes for water to move through the soil profile. And we actually then begin to see losses back out to rivers and streams and lakes and so forth, surface water. So as we've learned more about the ability of soils to hang on to phosphorus, we really found out that we've got two loss pathways for phosphorus. One is via surface water, but the other one is it can leach on out and go out to surface water that way. Okay, some graphics to kind of help get this across. On the x-axis here is a Melic 3. I'm not sure what you use there in Wisconsin, but this was some data that was generated in I think the Northeast. Now, looking at the different phosphorus levels, soil test phosphorus, and these are different soil types. What they were doing was looking at the relationship between the soil test phosphorus, getting up to some pretty high levels here. And at what point does you get what's called this break point, where the soil loses its ability to hang on to the phosphorus and you begin to lose it. And that's where you get this increased slope in this line. So on here on the y-axis, what we're looking at is dissolved phosphorus in surface runoff. so you can see that, again, you get up to these maybe medium to high levels of soil phosphorus, and we're beginning to see this tremendous increase in loss of phosphorus to surface waters. This slide, again on a melic scale, but what they're doing here is looking at the dissolved phosphorus in subsurface drainage. So the previous slide, I'll just back that up quick. This one, where you tended to have a separation of soil types, looks at surface water runoff of phosphorus, but this one looks at the dissolved phosphorus in subsurface drainage. And so again, we see this breakpoint in this particular set of studies. Breakpoint somewhere here at a little over 200 on a melic 3 soil phosphorus soil test. In the case of subsurface losses, the soil types tended to cluster together and act more similarly. Okay, so kind of established why we get the soil buildup. We know what happens now with the soil phosphorus, whether it be on the surface or whether it's down in the soil profile. So let's talk a little bit what we can do about reducing phosphorus in the diet of cows and how that impacts excreted phosphorus. So this was a study that was done looking at what would have been called a normal phosphorus diet, which is the blue bars, and then with a reduced phosphorus diet, which would be, so phosphorus intake, excuse me, is the blue bars. The red bars are the phosphorus in the manure. So in a normal phosphorus diet, we see probably approximately 100 and some grams a day of phosphorus being eaten. We see about maybe 70 grams in the manure. When we reduce that down to what's more recommended these days, we see a phosphorus intake here maybe around 70, and when we subsequently then that's going to reduce the phosphorus in manure by about 45%. So diet can do its part. So good formulation and knowing what's in your feeds from a phosphorus standpoint is important. I know that for years there's been this urban myth that, lower phosphorus is going to create problems with reproductive performance. This was a summary of 13 trials, actually by Dr. Satter, previously a faculty member there at the University of Wisconsin. And they looked at 13 trials, 785 cows, days to first estrus, days to first AI, and days open, and really saw no difference when they went from high phosphorus diets being about 0.39 to 0.61 down into what are the diet levels that we typically see more of today, which is about 0.3 to 0.4. So pretty good evidence that we really are not having an impairment on reproductive performance. These are some numbers on the bioavailability of phosphorus and different key feedstuffs. This work was done by the group at Virginia Tech. And this middle column here shows the total estimated available phosphorus from the more recent Virginia Tech research versus what was previously in the NRC, Natural Resource Council, for dairy cattle. And you can see in most cases we're seeing quite a bit more availability in these phosphorus in these feedstuffs than was originally. Basically, they kind of had them in two categories, about a 0.7, and then here for corn solids they gave it a 0.75, and then for alfalfa hay and silage they took it clear down to 0.64. But more recent data would suggest that it's actually more available. So it's important to utilize this more recent data when formulating diets. Okay, so another study that I thought was particularly telling, this one was run over 4 lactations. They started out with 100 first lactation Holstein Friesian cows. Over those 4 lactations, they end up with 95, 70, 50, and 22, completing each of the 4 lactations. In the winter, the cows were offered grass silage, maize, and concentrates. And this study was done overseas in Europe. So while during the summer, most of the cows were grazed, they were offered 3 to 4 kilograms or 7 to 10 pounds of concentrate a cow per day. In the winter period, they were able to reduce phosphorus content about 38% in the concentrate and about 25% in the total diet. In the summer period, they were able to get about 46% reduction in the concentrate and about 16% reduction in the total content of the diet. Again, I think the difference is being here that getting a lot of phosphorus coming there in the grass. We looked at, in this case, dry matter intakes, very similar across the 4 lactations between normal phosphorus diet and the reduced phosphorus diet, so not impacting intake of the animals. We looked at, or they looked at full lactation milk production, these being very similar, so no difference there. And then they looked at the reproductive performance. They looked at cows observed in heat within the first 6 weeks of calving, right around 60%. Days to first observed heat, right around 24. Conception to first AI, somewhere here around 35%, and conception to first and second AI, certainly pretty good here in the low to mid 60s. So really no difference in performance of these animals. Okay, so let's move away from that and get back to what can we do about capturing phosphorus. Okay, so back to our example here in Washington State. So we decided a number of years ago we wanted to look at this idea that we have a lot of alfalfa grown here in the middle of the state. It gets trucked over to Western Washington, but what are we doing about getting any of these excess nutrients back over to Eastern Washington? So we decided to concentrate on looking at least creating a regional nutrient recycling relationship here in the state. So we developed a project to look at this nutrient recycling relationship between the dairy producers and the alfalfa growers in the state. So on the left-hand side here is what we show as our mobile unit. It's called a fluidized cone, a fluidized bed in a cone, and we'll go into some more details about how that worked. We wanted it mobile because we wanted to take it to farm to test it on multiple farms to see how well we could extract phosphorus from manure that varied due to the farm conditions. These are some of our Eastern Washington alfalfa hay fields we worked with, commercial hay growers. This is applying some of this struvite that we captured, and this is what the actual material looks like. It's a sand-like material. When it comes out of the cone, it's damp. It would be just like wet sand, but it air dries very easily. So it's a very user-friendly kind of material. We aren't having to deal with water in terms of transport, so it really reduces transportation costs. And you can actually apply it just like this and get good fertilizer value out of it. The companies that have been involved in these systems actually do some work with purling and creating little spherical particles of the struvite for more uniform distribution and packaging and delivery and so forth. But you can use it actually just like this, and we've gotten really good responses. Okay, so here's a close-up of that material again. Pretty grainy material, and I just refer to it as sand, which it really does feel like that. The particular compound is called struvite. It's got some magnesium in it. It's got phosphorus, of course, which is going after, and it's got a little bit of ammonia. And it's got some heavily bound water. So it's got 6 waters, although you can see this material is very dry. So this is a fertilizer formula. So 629O plus 16. The plus 16 is for the magnesium. So those of you thinking fertilizer formulas, this is would be the pure struvite. This is what it would look like. So the technology that we use is it's called a fluidized bed. What you do is you put a bed of the struvite material in the bottom of the cone, and then as you treat material and the manure and run it up through the cone at a slow rate of flow, you will get formation of more struvite. So we're going to go through how that happens. So again, it's a fluidized bed in cone shape. What we first have to do is lower the pH of the manure, and the reason we have to do that is we have to break the bond between calcium and phosphorus. In dairy manure, in contrast to swine manure, we see a lot of the phosphorus is bound tightly to calcium, and so we have to break that bond. Then after we've done that and we've added magnesium to it, then we pump it up through the cone, and we boost the pH to about 7.5, and we do that with either ammonia or caustic soda. We found ammonia water was actually one of the best sources to accomplish this piece of it. Then again, magnesium chloride was a common material we used for getting the magnesium increased. So again, what we're doing is we're taking this bound calcium phosphorus, adding acid, getting free calcium and free phosphorus, particularly the phosphorus we need. We have enough ammonia typically in most of our manures, not a problem. We add a little bit of magnesium to make sure we've got enough magnesium there. And now we have our free phosphorus because we added the acid. And now we're able to make more struvite crystals as we raise the pH. So this is what the system looked like on a dairy that was implemented. The system was Jones Dairy in Maryland. Probably put this in maybe 8 years ago. They had a 2-cone system. And so when you pump the material, this would be a pre-treatment tank here on the right in the blue. This is what they would put, where they would put the acid and magnesium chloride, and then pump it out of there and up through this. And so as it goes up through this cone, it's swirling. It's a bed of swirling material, and that's how you get this swirling action, or the fluidized bed, to get production. So then as the bed grows, you simply shut the system down, drain the material out of the bottom of the bed, let it air dry, and you're ready to export it and use it as a fertilizer. They were treating about 60,000 gallons a day with these 2 cones. Their capital cost at that time was somewhere between $75 and $125 per cow. Operating cost somewhere between $80 and $100 a year. And on a per cow per day basis, it was about 15 to 20 cents. We're going to talk a little bit more about the economics at the end of this presentation. And while I know it's common to think in the dairy industry about cost per cow per day, you really need to look at a little different metric when we're thinking about trying to create phosphorus balance on the farm. Okay, so this is what our mobile system looked like. About a 24-foot trailer, excuse me. This cone was about 19 feet. We got our pre-treatment tank here, series of pumps and so forth. And this is what the actual system looked like. This is on a hydraulic lift, so it took about 60 seconds to lay this cone down, or 60 seconds to put it upright. So it was pretty easy to get it ready and transport from farm to farm, as we worked with dairy farms both on the eastern side of our state as well as the western side of our state. This is kind of the bottom of the cone, give you a bit of an idea. So these lines coming in here from the right, this would be where the caustic soda or the ammonia water would come in. This is a viewing screen right here where we could actually see how the fluidized beds were working. This line coming in here from the bottom is where the manure is pumped in. So when we looked at about 30 dairies across the state, we were able to see a reduction in orthophosphorus or total phosphorus, ortho being the inorganic phosphorus form, and samples leaving the cone compared to samples entering the cone. And that's how we used to estimate deficiency. So in 27 runs, when we had a positive reduction in removal, the average reduction in orthophosphate was 32%. And it ranged from 1 to 76. So we actually had some that didn't do very well, and you expect to see that. And when you're looking at a diversity of dairies that we actually had some that were pretty high, around 76%. Well, this manure that had the really high rate of removal was manure that actually had gone through an anaerobic digester. And the reason we're able to get this higher removal rate with anaerobically digested manure is that more of the organic phosphorus is converted into an inorganic phosphorus form, which allows us to capture more of that phosphorus. So again, remember, we got to have it in an inorganic form to combine with ammonia and magnesium to form that struvite compound. In 28 runs, the total phosphorus reduction was positive. We saw an average reduction of about 29. So again, these two statements, the only difference is this is ortho P, this is total P reduction. Again, we see anywhere from a range of a low end of 2 up to about 72%. Okay, transition. So now we have got this material captured. How well does it work on growing crops? In particular, we've done a lot of work at greenhouse level, research plot level. We want to take this to the actual farm and see how well the alfalfa growers liked it as a product, and see how well it would perform on, say, an acre of a field of 50 acres of alfalfa. So this particular picture is a farm that was putting in a new seeding, and they were using this particular spreader to apply material. You can see the white material coming out of the back. You see that the background in this is pretty hazy. This was actually one of our summers where we had huge wildfires during the summer, and this is actually smoke from the wildfires But anyhow, in this new seeding, we needed to apply about 64 pounds of phosphorus. And we had either what we called our control side of the field or the Struvite side of the field. For the control side of the field, to get that 64 pounds of P, we needed to apply about 123 pounds of monoammonium phosphate, 1152O. On the Struvite side, we did it as the Struvite, and we, because of the difference in the fertilizer ratio, we had to put about 221 pounds of that on. Okay, so it gives you, that was the starting year of a 3-year study. So in the second field, this is our second farm, 2 different locations. They were about 100 miles apart. Agronomic use Struvite. This was established stand. We needed about 30 pounds on the one part of the field, and we needed about 75 pounds of phosphorus on the other side to get them up to recommendations for based on their soil test phosphorus. Oops. So for the control side, we put on 57 pounds of MAP. And then for the Struvite side, we had a combination of some MAP as well as some Struvite. The reason we balanced this out in this case was with some monoammonium phosphate and some Struvite. We wanted to avoid any potential, on this particular farm, any potential risk of seeing a yield hit. So here's some of the alfalfa hay yields over the 3-year period. In this particular farm, Farm 1, this was the established alfalfa field, and these are the cuttings, or the yields at each cutting. Blue being the monoammonium phosphate only, and then the orange bars being Struvite or Struvite plus monoammonium phosphate. You can see that the yields are fairly similar between the 2 treatments across all of these different cuttings. So it did quite well. The producer was pretty happy with it. This is at the second farm, or was a new seeding. And we weren't able to collect data until 2018 because it was seeded in the fall of 2017. Again, you can see that we've got fairly similar yields. In some cases, you'll see Struvite being a little bit higher, like these 3 in particular. Then you have some where you might see a bit of an advantage to the monoammonium phosphate only. Because we combined that data between farms and looked over years, then this is how the summary looked. 2017 similar, 18 maybe a slight advantage, in 19 maybe a slight disadvantage in 2020. But when we pull all that data over 3 years, 2 farms, 50-acre sized fields for each treatment control, we're seeing a very similar production of alfalfa. Now let's look at how the alfalfa did in taking up phosphorus. Again, this is the first farm, the established stand, and they performed very similarly, although in 2017 second cut, in 2019 first cut, we did see quite a distinct advantage in phosphorus uptake with the Struvite fertilizer. This is farm 2, the new seeding. Again, similar responses. Everything's pretty similar. You do see a few situations where 2019 third cut, 2020 third cut, where actually Struvite, and actually here second and third cuts where you see an advantage to greater phosphorus uptake. So again, pulling it across farms for the 3 years, very similar response, and for whatever reason here in 2019 actually seemed to perform a little bit better. So from a yield standpoint, phosphorus uptake standpoint, it really was a success, and the producers are really pretty happy with the material. We have looked at the use of phosphorus on other crops. We've grown triticale, looked at oats, corn silage, coarse alfalfa, potatoes, and then a number of horticultural crops. So the material really has a wide use in terms of an end crop. Okay, so now let's get into the economics piece. Is probably what you've all been waiting for. So based on studies we ran here in Washington State, and then you saw some reference to the Jones Dairy there in Maryland. So our estimations are that it's going to cost about, for the chemicals, about 22 cents to about 39 cents per cow per day. The 22 cents is when we use anaerobically digested manure. And the reason again is we can capture more of the phosphorus. So we get more bang for the buck when we use anaerobically digested manure. If we go with the raw manure, it's going to cost us pushing 40 cents a cow per day. But it's really not a very telling number. And the reason is that you really need to be looking at how much phosphorus do I need to remove from the farm to get balance. And so each farm is going to have its own unique answer to this. And this cents per cow per day really isn't the best metric to consider. So we really need to look at how much phosphorus needs to be exported to get balance. So we're going to go through that exercise now. So what we did is we took the data we had from our studies, and we looked at a base farm that had 500 acres of crops, and it had 60 pounds of phosphorus uptake in those crops, whether it be a single crop or multiple cropping. Typically, this would be a multiple cropping for us here, where you have a primary crop and then either cover crop or double cropping. And if we look at then the cost for different size farms, so if you got a 1,000 cow farm, in order to get balance on that farm, you're going to be pushing somewhere around $700,000, which all of you are shocked by that. In the raw manure, if you go to anaerobic digest manure, you can basically about half that cost. Again, more of the phosphorus available to be extracted. If you have 750 cows, these numbers drop down to 300 and 160 for either raw or anaerobically digested manure. And then when we get down to 600 cows, we see the price drop down to about 70,000 versus about 36,000. So again, this is at a set number of acres, a set uptake of phosphorus, and then letting number of cows vary. So it begins to push the point of how many acres do you have for each cow, growing crops, and that has a big influence on your ability to get this phosphorus balance. So the other way we looked at this was we took 1,000 lactating cows, same uptake of phosphorus, but we varied the number of acres that the manure was available to be applied on from those lactating cows. And so if we go with 600 acres and vary that all the way up to pushing about 900 acres, you can see how dramatically the price decreases. Of course, we still continue to have this difference and a price advantage to using anaerobically digested manure. So with that, kind of brought it full circle. We've talked about the cropping, we've talked about use of manure, or feeding practices. We've talked about utilizing this phosphorus for crop production, both with alfalfa, and told you that there are some other farms or other crops that can be grown. So I think we really have something that's got room for growth. In terms of this technology, it's currently being used in wastewater treatment plants for municipal. There in Wisconsin, actually. Also here in Boise, Idaho area, California, and then worldwide. And the growth of use of this technology on the agricultural side has been a bit slow, but we think that as opportunities are there in the future, and as we get farms that are willing to test this out, that we can begin to see a real success story here for recycling phosphorus. So with that, I'll take some questions.
Well, thank you. I'm not seeing anything come through the chat yet, but we do want to make sure that we thank you, Dr. Harrison, for the great presentation.